A warm afternoon in a quiet town turned into something unforgettable when a single request pierced the stillness. A man, his loyal partner at his side, and a child too small for the burden she carried crossed paths in a way that would leave no one the same. If stories of resilience and compassion speak to you, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and share in the comments where you are watching from. Officer Daniel Hayes, a black police officer in his mid-30s, sat on a worn wooden bench beneath the tallest maple tree in Brookside Park, his dark blue uniform neatly pressed, though his badge was tucked beneath his shirt to soften the image he carried. His broad frame looked imposing to strangers, but those who knew him understood the quiet weight of compassion that guided his steps far more than the authority of his badge. Beside him rested Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, with a coat that gleamed black along his spine and softened into golden brown along his legs. Ranger was more than a partner. He was Daniel's shadow, a sentinel with instincts sharper than any training could instill. The spring afternoon unfolded gently around them. The air was fresh with the scent of cut grass. Children's laughter drifted from the swings in the distance, and sparrows darted low across the pond's rippled surface. For Daniel, it was one of those rare moments of stillness, a brief reprieve from the storm of calls, confrontations, and crises that usually defined his days. He opened his lunchbox, unwrapped his turkey sandwich, and set aside half as he always did. He smiled down at Ranger. "You know the drill," he said, with the easy cadence of habit. Ranger's ears perked, his amber eyes fixed on the sandwich, but he did not lunge or whine. He waited patient until Daniel tossed him a biscuit. The dog caught it with a snap of precision before lying back down, chewing with the calm certainty of a soldier at ease in safe company. Brookside Park was the kind of place where lives quietly intersected. Near the walking path sat Thomas and Margaret Whitfield, an elderly couple who had made a ritual of feeding breadcrumbs to the pigeons. Margaret's hair was pure white, pulled into a bun, her lavender scarf wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the breeze. Thomas leaned on his cane, his posture stooped, but his eyes sharp with memory. When Margaret's gaze drifted toward Daniel, her voice trembled with recognition. "He reminds me of Michael," she whispered, invoking the name of their son, who had died years earlier in the line of duty. Thomas nodded slowly, his hand resting gently over hers. Their son had once served alongside Daniel, and though tragedy had torn Michael away, they had never blamed Daniel. Sometimes their grief drew them back to the park, where they might catch a glimpse of the man who had carried their son out of danger, the man who had survived. For them, Daniel's presence was both a wound and a salve, a living reminder of loss and resilience intertwined. Daniel took a slow bite of his sandwich, scanning the park, as was his habit. His training never truly allowed him to relax, even in moments of peace. Ranger mirrored him, ears twitching, eyes narrowing at the faintest movement. The ritual between them, the half sandwich set aside, the biscuit tossed, was one that had built itself over years of loyalty. Daniel chuckled softly. "Don't look at me like that, partner. You know there's more." Ranger thumped his tail once against the bench leg, the sound sharp against the wood, but otherwise remained still. Then the moment shifted. A faint rustle rose from behind the trash bin near the tree line, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind had Ranger not stiffened instantly. His body straightened his biscuit, forgotten his nose twitching as he stared fixedly toward the source. Daniel followed the gaze, his heartbeat slowing into an anticipatory rhythm. At first, he saw only shadows, the curve of rusted metal weeds curling at the base of the bin. But then, emerging like a ghost into the light, came the fragile outline of a child. She was no more than 7, her small frame swallowed by a faded pink dress that had once been bright, but now hung in tatters, stained and frayed at every edge. Her hair was tangled into uneven strands that clung to her cheeks. Her skin bore the marks of dust and hunger, and her feet were bare, pressing awkwardly against the stones of the gravel path. Yet what struck Daniel most were her eyes. Wide, dark, and unblinking, they locked on the sandwich in his hand with a hunger that spoke of more than missed meals. They carried loneliness, desperation, and the kind of silent plea a child should never need to make. Daniel's hand lowered the sandwich slowly to the table. His throat tightened as the reality before him cut through the warmth of the day. He did not speak, not yet. Sometimes words frightened away what was fragile. Across the park, Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Do you see her?" she whispered. Thomas squinted, his lips tightening. "She's been there a while," Margaret added, her voice heavy with guilt. "We didn't notice. But the dog did." Thomas muttered, his eyes shifting to Ranger. The German Shepherd had not barked, had not growled. Instead, he tilted his head and wagged his tail once deliberately, a gesture neither threatening nor excited, but welcoming. It was the kind of movement Daniel had seen countless times when Ranger approached frightened children during school demonstrations, a subtle signal of safety. The girl's body tensed, her small hands curling into fists at her sides, as if ready to flee, yet she did not move. She stared, transfixed by the simple act of a man eating lunch with his dog. Daniel's chest tightened. He had seen hunger before, but rarely in such raw form. The girl's eyes were not just fixed on food. They were fixed on belonging, on the impossible thought that maybe, just maybe, she could sit at that table too. His instincts as a cop urged caution, but something deeper stirred a memory of his own past, when he too had been a boy with no one watching, surviving off scraps and silence. He forced his breath to steady, to remain calm for her sake. He knew this moment was more delicate than any arrest, more fragile than any crime scene. The park around them faded into background noise. The breeze whispered through the maple branches, birds chirped faintly, but for Daniel, the world narrowed to the space between himself, Ranger, and the child, half hidden in shadow. A heartbeat passed, then another. The girl's lips pressed tightly together as her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She looked at Ranger again, her eyes catching the slow sway of his tail. Something softened in her posture. Daniel leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice ready to break the silence, but he stopped. This was not his moment to command. This was hers, and he sensed that the tiniest gesture could shatter her fragile courage. So he waited his sandwich, resting forgotten on the table, his eyes steady, his body still. He let Ranger speak in the only way a dog could, with patience, presence, and quiet trust. But for Daniel, time had narrowed into a fragile corridor where one wrong move might shatter everything. His fingers pressed lightly against the sandwich on the bench, his mind racing through what to do next. He had dealt with armed suspects and desperate situations, but this was somehow more perilous because here stood a child who could vanish at the smallest hint of rejection. He leaned back slightly to appear less imposing, softening his posture, lowering his shoulders, letting his hands rest on a lap. He knew the girl was measuring every detail, deciding if this was safety or threat. The child took a small step forward, her head ducked as though she were intruding on something sacred. Her lips trembled and her eyes darted between the food and the towering man before her. Ranger, sensing her hesitation, rose silently to his feet. He walked toward her with careful grace, his paws soundless on the grass, his head lowered to appear less intimidating. When he reached her, he paused, lifted his snout slowly, and pressed it gently against her small hand. The girl flinched, her whole body tightening, but then something miraculous happened. Instead of pulling away, she allowed her fingers to rest against his fur. For the first time in who knew how many days, she felt warmth from another living being. Daniel's heart stumbled in his chest, the sight nearly undoing him. His voice caught, but he forced it into something steady quiet, almost a whisper carried by the breeze. "You can come closer," he said. The girl's throat worked as she swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, was so faint, Daniel almost thought he imagined it. "Can I eat with you?" The words pierced him deeper than any blade could have. There was no demand in her tone, only a desperate hope, a plea born of hunger and loneliness. For a moment, Daniel's own past flashed before his eyes himself at 9 years old, cold hungry, hiding behind a laundromat, whispering similar words to the officer who had saved his life. That memory flooded him with urgency and compassion. He smiled, his gray-blue eyes softening as he nodded. "Of course you can. There's plenty." He reached for the other half of his sandwich and unwrapped it carefully, placing it on the bench across from him. The girl moved with the caution of a deer stepping into open ground. Each small shuffle brought her closer until she stood at the edge of the bench. She climbed up hesitantly, her knees drawn up beneath her, her posture stiff as though expecting someone to yell at her or push her away. Ranger sat beside her, pressing his body close enough to reassure her without overwhelming. Daniel placed the sandwich before her, his voice calm and warm. "Turkey and cheese. I hope that's okay." She nodded quickly, her eyes glistening with something between relief and disbelief. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, as if afraid it might vanish if she gripped it too tightly. Then, with deliberate slowness, she took her first bite. Daniel watched as her shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in her small frame easing for the first time since she appeared. He didn't press her with questions. He let her chew, let her settle into the rhythm of something as ordinary as eating lunch. Ranger leaned his head onto her lap, his tail wagging softly when her fingers absent-mindedly stroked his ear. Across the park, Margaret and Thomas Whitfield stopped scattering breadcrumbs, both watching silently, their eyes misty. As they witnessed the fragile moment unfolding, Margaret whispered, "She's so small." Thomas shook his head, "And so hungry." Their grief for their son intertwined now with a growing ache for this little girl who had materialized from shadows. The girl paused between bites, finally daring to speak again. Her voice was clearer this time, though still hesitant. "My name is Emma." Daniel smiled gently, his tone firm enough to reassure her, but still soft. "Nice to meet you, Emma. I'm Daniel, and this guy here is Ranger." Emma looked down at the dog, her lips curving slightly upward for the first time. "He's really soft," she murmured. "He's got a big heart too," Daniel replied, "and a good nose for good people." Emma glanced at him quickly as if testing if he meant it, then returned to her sandwich. Not far away, a few parkgoers had begun to notice the strange trio at the bench, a uniformed officer, his loyal dog, and a ragged child, eating as if she had never seen food before. Whispers rippled among them, some murmuring sympathy, others muttering disapproval. Daniel caught the glances, but leaned closer to Emma, his voice low. "Ignore them. Just eat. You're safe here." She nodded faintly, her small hands clutching the sandwich as if it were a lifeline. Ranger placed a paw gently on the bench near her, anchoring her even more. Emma took a sip of water from Daniel's bottle when he offered it, drinking cautiously at first, before gulping gratefully. He asked softly, "Do you come here often?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I just saw the food." Daniel gave her another smile. "Well, I'm glad you came over." His words carried no judgment, only acceptance, and they seemed to settle into her like sunlight warming cold skin. Unbeknownst to them, on a nearby bench sat Grace Parker, a journalist who had come to the park seeking inspiration. She had not planned to film, but something about the sight of a weary officer, a loyal dog, and a hungry child sharing food stirred her deeply. With hesitant hands, she lifted her phone and began to record, not out of intrusion, but reverence. Her lens captured Emma's trembling fingers, Ranger's steady companionship, and Daniel's quiet kindness. She did not yet know what she would do with the footage, only that the world needed to see it. For Emma, the sandwich was more than food. It was proof that someone noticed her, that she was not invisible. Each bite eased the hard shell of fear around her, each moment of silence at the table whispering that perhaps she belonged, if only for this fleeting afternoon. She looked at Daniel again, her eyes brighter now, and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head softly. "You don't have to thank me. Everyone deserves a place at the table. Ranger leaned against her legs, letting out a contented sigh as if to second the statement. The sandwich trembled in her small hands, and Daniel pretended not to notice how ravenously she wanted to devour it. He remembered his own shame when he had been her age, caught stealing crusts from a dumpster stomach hollow, but pride still clinging to his bones. He had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was not to draw attention to hunger, but simply to make room for someone to eat. Emma's dark eyes lifted briefly to him before darting back down, wary, uncertain, but something in her breathing shifted. Each bite slowed, and for the first time since she approached, she was not inhaling food in fear of it being snatched away. She was tasting it, chewing carefully, as though daring to believe she might get another. Daniel caught the subtle change, and it settled his heart. Across the path, Margaret Whitfield pressed a tissue against her eyes. Her husband Thomas frowned, gripping his cane tightly. "That poor child," Margaret whispered. "It's not right." Thomas nodded grimly. They had buried their own son, and yet seeing this girl lost and alone stirred a grief of a different shape. It reminded them that tragedy wasn't only in sudden loss. Sometimes it was in the quiet erosion of a child's innocence and hunger that no one noticed. They watched Daniel, remembering how he had stood at their son's funeral silent and broken the weight of survival heavy on his shoulders. Now, to see him extending that same fragile mercy to a child of strangers seemed to close a circle neither of them could articulate. Emma shifted, pulling her legs closer to her chest. Her voice was barely audible. "I used to eat sandwiches with my mom." Daniel's chest tightened. He set his own sandwich down, folded his hands on the table, and waited, letting her continue at her pace. She would toast the bread and press it so it was crunchy. She said food tasted better if you smiled while eating it. Emma's lips trembled, but no tears fell. Her small hand stroked Ranger's ear, absently clinging to the comfort. Daniel nodded gently. "Your mom sounds wise." Emma swallowed hard. "She got sick last winter. We didn't have anywhere warm to go." Silence stretched. Daniel forced his throat to loosen enough to answer. "I'm sorry, Emma. I really am." Ranger shifted closer, resting more of his weight against her. Emma let out a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the pond where ducks drifted lazily. Her voice came again, small but clearer. "After she died, my dad left. He said I was too much trouble." The words landed like stones in Daniel's chest. He remembered the echo of similar rejection, different in detail, but identical in cruelty. He had known what it felt like to be too much and not enough all at once. He drew in a slow breath, steadying his voice. "That wasn't your fault, none of it." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for signs of pity. He gave none, only truth, only steadiness. A breeze swept through the park, scattering blossoms across the table. Emma caught one, its petals fragile in her hand. For a moment she seemed lighter, almost like any child, marveling at the small beauty of nature. But the weight returned quickly. "I thought no one saw me anymore," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the ones who matter see you when you need it most." Ranger punctuated the words by licking her hand once slow and deliberate, making her giggle softly despite herself. The sound cracked Daniel open inside a glimpse of the child she had been, before grief hardened her edges. At a bench nearby, Grace Parker lowered her phone slightly, wiping at her eyes. She had filmed hundreds of moments as a journalist, but rarely had she felt she was capturing something sacred. She whispered to herself, "The world needs to see this." She zoomed in again, focusing on Emma's tentative smile, on the way Daniel's expression softened, as if he were looking at his own younger self, and on Ranger's protective stillness. She had not planned for this, but destiny rarely asked permission. Emma's hunger eased after the sandwich was gone, but she remained seated, fingers twisting the hem of her dress as if afraid standing might break the spell of belonging. Daniel reached into his cooler and pulled out a small packet of crackers, sliding it toward her without a word. She hesitated, then took them. slipping one to Ranger with a grin that was more genuine this time. "He deserves it," she said. Daniel chuckled. "He always does." For a brief moment, they were not a cop, a stray, and a service dog. They were simply three souls sharing lunch under a maple tree. As the sun shifted overhead, the space between them grew less fragile. Emma leaned into Ranger, her cheek resting against his fur, while Daniel watched in silence, his heart caught between sorrow and hope. He knew this was only the beginning, that hunger and loss could not be erased with one sandwich, but he also knew something irreversible had happened. A bond had formed, a fragile thread connecting them, spun in the quiet grace of compassion. He remembered the officer who had once found him, offered him food, and asked his name. That simple act had saved his life. Now, without even meaning to, he had become that figure for someone else. The sun drifted lower across Brookside Park, stretching long shadows across the gravel path, where Daniel, Emma, and Ranger shared their fragile peace at the wooden bench. Emma leaned against the German Shepherd, her small fingers absently combing through his fur as she finished the crackers Daniel had offered. Her face still carried the hollowness of hunger and loss, but there was a new softness around her eyes, a glimmer of security, taking root for the first time in months. Daniel sat quietly across from her, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp, every detail of the scene searing into his memory. He had been on the other side of this table once, a child himself, who had needed someone to notice someone to believe he was worth feeding. Now he was the one offering the sandwich, the one offering presence instead of pity. That reversal weighed heavy, but also lifted him in a way he had not expected. Across the park, whispers had begun to ripple. Families strolling along the path slowed their pace, their eyes drawn to the strange trio, a uniformed black officer, his service dog, and a barefoot little girl in a torn dress eating as though it were her first meal in days. Some of the murmurs carried curiosity, others judgment, a few sympathy. "Is that a homeless kid?" one man muttered to his wife. "Shouldn't he take her to the station?" a woman whispered, clutching her child's hand tighter as they passed. The opinions moved like a tide, unseen by Emma, but felt by Daniel. He knew how quickly compassion could be drowned out by suspicion. He also knew that Emma didn't need the weight of strangers' stares. She needed a safe place to breathe. At the bench beneath the flowering dogwood tree, Grace Parker adjusted her phone in her hands, capturing the unfolding moment with steady focus. She was a journalist, but not the kind who chased headlines of scandal or spectacle. She had built her quiet reputation on pieces that revealed humanity in its smallest gestures, kindness overlooked in a world too obsessed with conflict. When she had entered the park that day, she had been searching for peace, not a story. Yet here it was uninvited, but undeniable. She zoomed in as Emma leaned into Ranger, capturing the subtle way Daniel's eyes softened as he watched the girl's shoulders loosen for the first time. Grace's throat tightened as she realized she was recording not just a scene, but a prayer in motion, a sacred intersection of lives bound by loss and resilience. On another bench, Margaret and Thomas Whitfield observed in silence, their hands intertwined. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief while Thomas's jaw set in a hard line. They had watched Daniel for years, ever since the night he carried their son's lifeless body from the inferno that had claimed him. They had grieved with dignity, never blaming Daniel, but his survival had tethered them to him in ways neither could sever. To see him now bending his strength into gentleness for a child no one else seemed to notice moved them beyond words. Margaret whispered, "He's turning into the kind of man our son always believed he could be." Thomas squeezed her hand, his voice gruff. "No, he already is." Emma, unaware of the weight of all the eyes upon her, turned her attention back to Daniel. She asked softly, "Why are you nice to me?" The question pierced him. He held her gaze, choosing his words with care. "Because someone was nice to me when I needed it most, and everyone deserves kindness." She looked down at Ranger, who wagged his tail in perfect timing, as if to affirm the statement. She smiled faintly and offered the dog another cracker. Daniel chuckled. He's going to expect you to share everything with him now. For a fleeting moment, the bench felt like a kitchen table, the three of them bound by something deeper than circumstance. Still, the whispers from nearby benches continued. Daniel caught the look of a man frowning in their direction, his arms crossed in judgment. He recognized the expression. He had seen it countless times on the job, suspicion veiled as concern. He leaned slightly closer to Emma, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Ignore them. People talk, but they don't always understand. What matters is you're safe here. She nodded, her lips pressing together as though bracing herself against the invisible weight of those whispers. Ranger pressed his paw gently against her leg, steady as stone. Grace lowered her phone after a few more minutes, tucking it into her bag. She had not decided whether she would publish the video or keep it for herself, but she knew the image would never leave her. Emma's gaunt hands clutching the Sandwich Ranger's calm loyalty, Daniel's steady eyes, all of it was a testimony the world too often refused to hear. She blinked against the tears stinging her eyes, whispering, "The world needs to remember this kind of love." As the afternoon waned, Daniel offered Emma a small bottle of water. She drank greedily at first, then paused, holding the bottle delicately as though it were precious. She whispered, "I didn't think anyone saw me anymore." Daniel's chest tightened, his voice catching before he spoke. "Sometimes the ones who matter see you when you need it most. And I see you, Emma." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked younger, less burdened, as though his words had peeled away layers of fear and invisibility. She leaned into Ranger, her cheek pressing against the dog's warm fur, and closed her eyes. The park continued around them, children's voices rising and falling, birds darting across the pond blossoms, scattering in the breeze. But for Daniel, the moment was frozen. He could feel the line of his life shifting again, just as it had the day Officer Bernard Whitaker had found him behind that laundromat years ago. He remembered how it felt to be seen, to be fed, to be welcomed when he thought he had no worth. Now it was his turn to pass that mercy forward. And though he knew challenges lay ahead, questions, paperwork, procedures, he also knew he could not walk away from Emma. Not now, not ever. The whispers of strangers still drifted faintly across the park, but they no longer mattered to him. What mattered was the little girl sitting across from him, a child who had dared to step forward with nothing but a fragile voice and a plea for food. He could see she was holding back the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together, the constant flicker of her eyes. She was still balancing on the razor's edge between trust and fear. He decided that if she was going to share her story, it would have to be on her own terms. So he leaned back slightly, giving her space, and waited. Emma's fingers traced the outline of Ranger's ear, her voice finally breaking through the quiet. "My mama used to make sandwiches," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, not with urgency, but with patience, encouraging her with a soft nod. Emma continued her words, halting but heavy. She toasted the bread and pressed it flat so it was warm and crunchy. She said food tasted better when you smiled, even if your tummy hurt. Daniel swallowed hard, his own memories flooding back. He could still remember the officer who had told him something similar, that food was better when you had someone to share it with. Emma's eyes grew glassy, and her voice dropped even lower. "She died last winter. She got real sick, and we didn't have anywhere warm to go." Daniel's hands tightened into fists on his lap, his jaw clenching as he fought back his own surge of grief. He wanted to tell her it was unfair that no child should carry such pain, but he knew what she needed was presence, not platitudes. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I'm really sorry." Ranger nudged her with his snout, sensing her sorrow and responding with instinctive comfort. She gave a weak smile at the gesture, but her words poured out with the kind of force that came when silence had lasted too long. "She tried to get help," Emma said, her fists clenching in her lap, but every place was full, or they said we needed papers we didn't have. She told me not to worry, said we would figure it out. She always said that. Her lips trembled, but she held back tears with a strength that seemed too old for her small body. Daniel's throat tightened further, the echo of his own childhood loneliness roaring in his mind. He had been there too, hearing promises from a mother who had nothing left to give, feeling the world's indifference weigh heavier with every passing day. "And your dad?" Daniel asked carefully, knowing it was a question that might hurt, but sensing it was the truth she was already carrying. Emma's mouth twisted, her eyes narrowing as though she was trying to hold back anger. "He left after Mama died," she said bitterly. "Said I was too much trouble. He took the heater in his jacket and just walked out. He didn't look back." The words dropped like stones, each syllable slicing the air between them. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. He looked at her small fists, her bony frame, her haunted eyes, and every fiber of him wanted to shield her from the cruelty she had endured. He leaned closer, his voice firm but gentle. "That was not your fault, Emma. None of it. You didn't deserve that." Ranger pressed his body closer to her, curling around her as if to create a barrier against the memory. Emma's hand slid down his snout, her thumb brushing the coarse fur with trembling affection. She let out a shaky laugh, though it was threaded with sadness. "He doesn't talk much," she said, nodding at Ranger. Daniel smiled faintly. "No, but he listens better than most people." As if to agree, Ranger gave her hand a slow lick, drawing another small laugh from her lips. For a moment, the heaviness in her eyes lifted, replaced by a spark of something brighter. Across the park, Grace Parker lowered her phone for a moment, her heart breaking as she absorbed the rawness of Emma's confession. She had covered stories of crime and politics, but nothing had ever pierced her the way this small child's voice did. She whispered under her breath, "The world needs to hear this." She pressed record again, capturing the way Daniel's face softened as he listened, the way his silence carried more comfort than 1,000 words. Emma tilted her face toward the pond, her eyes fixed on the lazy movements of the ducks. "I thought maybe if I stayed real quiet, I could just disappear," she admitted. "Nobody wanted me anyway." Daniel leaned forward sharply, his voice steady, but his eyes burning. "Emma, you are not invisible. You matter. You deserve to be seen." She blinked rapidly, and for the first time, a tear slipped down her cheek. Ranger nudged her again, and this time she buried her face into his fur, her small shoulders shaking silently. Daniel let her cry, his heart breaking as he watched her cling to the dog for comfort. He remembered when he had been the one crying in silence, clutching a stray blanket in an alley while the world walked by. He thought of the night Officer Bernard Whitaker had found him, fed him, and told him he mattered. That act had rewritten the course of his life. Now he was sitting across from a child who needed the same mercy, and he felt the weight of destiny pressing against him. The Whitfields, still seated on their bench, exchanged a glance heavy with memory. Margaret's eyes glistened as she whispered, "She's so much like the boy he used to be." Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe this is why he survived when Michael didn't. Maybe he was meant to be here for her. The couple held each other's hands tightly, watching as the past and present folded together in the most unexpected of ways. Emma lifted her head, finally wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her voice was raw but steady. "I thought no one saw me anymore." Daniel shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "I see you, and I won't stop." Ranger pressed his head against her side, and she hugged him tightly, whispering, "You have a good human." Daniel chuckled softly, but his chest swelled with a fierce determination. He knew then that this was no passing encounter. Emma's story was now tied to his as tightly as his had once been tied to Whitaker's, and he vowed silently but firmly that he would not fail her. She had spoken of her mother's death, her father's abandonment, and her crushing invisibility, and though the words had been like shards of glass, she had spoken them without breaking. Daniel saw himself in her alone, hungry, convinced the world did not care whether he lived or died. And in that recognition came a decision. He had never shared his own story with strangers, but Emma was no stranger now. If she was to believe she mattered, she needed to know that the man sitting across from her understood because he had walked the same dark path. He drew a breath, steadying his voice before speaking. "Emma," he said softly, and her head lifted just enough for her eyes to meet his. "You and I aren't so different. You think no one sees you, but I see you because I was you once." Emma blinked, her brow furrowing, as though she couldn't quite believe him. Daniel continued, his voice low, measured but weighted with truth. "When I was 9, I didn't have anywhere to go either. My mom died when I was young, and my dad was never around. I slept behind gas stations, picked food out of dumpsters hid under old bleachers in the winter. I thought no one cared if I made it through the night." He paused, letting the words settle, watching as Emma's lips parted slightly, her breath catching. "One night I was trying to steal a bag of chips from a vending machine behind a laundromat. I was cold, hungry, and scared. That's when a cop found me." He leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting for a moment toward the pond, shimmering in the distance as the memory pulled him in. "He didn't yell. He didn't arrest me. He bought me dinner. He sat down with me, asked my name, and told me I wasn't invisible." Emma stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of a lie, but all she found was a man speaking from scars that still lived under his skin. She whispered, "He helped you." Daniel nodded slowly, his voice thick. "More than helped me. He checked on me every week, made sure I was in school. When I turned 18, he adopted me. His name is Bernard Whitaker, and he's the reason I became a cop. He taught me that kindness is stronger than judgment." His hand pressed briefly against his badge hidden beneath his shirt. "Everything I do now, Emma, is because he once looked at me and said I was worth saving." For the first time since she had approached the bench, Emma's expression softened into something close to wonder. She glanced down at Ranger, stroking his fur with more confidence now, then looked back at Daniel. "So you were like me?" she asked hesitantly. "Exactly like you," he said firmly. "Cold, scared, and certain nobody would notice if I disappeared. But one man did notice, and it changed my life. And now I notice you." The word struck her like a wave, her eyes widening before tears welled again. Not from despair this time, but from a fragile hope trying to take root. Ranger shifted, laying his head on Emma's lap, and she giggled softly as his nose nudged against her hand. The sound was small, but filled with light, a crack in the darkness she had carried. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had seen hardened criminals crumble under the weight of their mistakes, but watching a child reclaim even a fraction of joy felt more powerful than any arrest he had ever made. From the bench under the dogwood, Grace Parker's hands trembled as she adjusted her phone, the camera capturing every flicker of emotion. Her eyes were wet, her throat tight because she knew this was no ordinary story. It was a living testament to survival, to compassion, to cycles of pain broken by acts of grace. She whispered to herself, "The world needs to hear this," and pressed record again with renewed determination. Across the path, Margaret Whitfield leaned closer to her husband. Her voice cracked as she murmured, "He's becoming what that officer was for him. Can you see it?" Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. "I see it. He's carrying the same torch." Their grief intertwined with pride as they watched Daniel reach back into his own past to hand a flicker of hope to Emma. Emma's voice came again, small but steady. "Do you still see him? The cop who helped you?" Daniel smiled faintly, pulling his wallet from his pocket. He opened it carefully, sliding out a worn photograph, laminated and faded with age. He placed it on the table where she could see. The picture showed a skinny boy with messy hair grinning beside a tall man with a gray mustache and thick glasses, crouched beside a scrappy dog with one ear flopped sideways. "That's me," and Officer Whitaker Daniel explained. "And that's his dog, Bingo. Ugliest dog you ever saw, but he had a heart as big as Ranger's." Emma giggled, her hand covering her mouth. His ear looks like it melted. Daniel laughed softly, nodding. Yeah, he walked in circles, but he was loyal, just like Ranger. Emma studied the photo with reverence, her fingers hovering over it as though afraid to touch something so precious. Her eyes lingered, soaking in proof that the man before her truly understood, truly lived the same pain she did. When she finally looked back at Daniel, her voice carried the faintest trace of trust. Do you think he'd be proud of you? Daniel didn't hesitate. I think he already is. The moment stretched heavy, yet healing as Emma smiled. For real this time, the corners of her mouth curving upward, reaching her eyes. She looked down at Ranger and whispered, "You have a good human." Ranger's tail thumped against the bench in quiet agreement, and Daniel felt a warmth spread through him he hadn't felt in years. He realized that in sharing his past, he had given Emma something more than food or water. He had given her proof that survival was possible, that scars could be bridges instead of walls. The sun dipped lower, casting amber light across the park, and for Daniel, the day no longer felt like an accident. It felt like destiny. Years ago, a cop had chosen to notice him, to save him, and now he had been placed in Emma's path for the same reason. He vowed silently that whatever came next, paperwork, questions, judgment, he would not let her vanish back into the shadows. She deserved more than invisibility. She deserved the same chance he had been given. And with Ranger's steady presence beside them, he knew he would fight for that chance with everything he had. The stiffness had eased. The trembling in her hands had lessened, and for the first time in months, her smile had reached her eyes. Daniel watched her with quiet pride, his chest tightening as he thought of how far she had already come in just a single afternoon. He had told her about Officer Whitaker and about the kindness that had saved his life, and in doing so, he had given her a reason to believe that she might be worth saving too. Ranger remained at her side, his head resting against her small knee, a loyal anchor whose steady breathing seemed to steady hers. What Daniel didn't know was that the moment had already begun to stretch far beyond the park, carried by the hands of a witness who had been recording with a trembling but determined grip. Grace Parker sat on her bench under the dogwood tree, her heart pounding as she pressed stop on her phone. She looked down at the screen, the captured footage glowing back at her. It was not slick, not polished, not staged, but it carried a weight heavier than any professional camera could have delivered. She replayed a few seconds, watching Emma whisper her gratitude, watching Daniel place the photograph in front of her, watching Ranger wag his tail in affirmation. Grace wiped her eyes quickly, but the tears came again as she whispered to herself, "People need to see this." She hadn't expected to stumble into a story that afternoon, but she knew the power of what she had captured. It was not just an act of kindness. It was a revelation of what humanity could still be in a world that often seemed so indifferent. She posted the video that night, pairing it with a short caption. A hungry girl asked a cop and his K9 if she could eat with them. What happened next will restore your faith in kindness. She hesitated before hitting upload, her finger hovering as doubts flooded her. Was she exploiting the child? Was she exposing something that should remain private? But the image of Emma's hollow eyes when she first emerged from behind the trash bin silenced her doubts. The world had looked away from this girl too many times. It was time for people to look and not turn aside. Grace pressed upload, her chest tight, and then leaned back on the bench, staring at the sky as if praying she had done the right thing. Within an hour, the video began to spread. A handful of shares turned into dozens, then hundreds. By midnight, it had crossed into the thousands. The footage touched nerves across social media, where endless arguments often drowned compassion. But here, the reaction was different. Comment after comment flowed in voices trembling across the screen. "I'm crying watching this. This broke me. No child should ever feel invisible. Where can I help? Where can I send money for her? The world was watching Emma Ranger and Daniel, and the response was unlike anything Grace had ever seen. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of his phone buzzing against the nightstand. He reached for it groggily, frowning when he saw dozens of missed calls and unread messages. His first thought was that something had happened at work, but when he opened the first notification, his eyes widened. It was Grace's video, the title glaring across the screen: "Cop shares lunch with homeless girl and his loyal dog." You won't believe what happens next. He tapped it open, his heart racing as the park scene unfolded in shaky but reverent detail. He saw himself from the outside, saw Emma's trembling hands and her shy smile, saw Ranger wagging once as if offering silent permission. The video ended with Emma whispering, "You have a good human," and Ranger's tail thumping in reply. Daniel sat frozen on the edge of his bed, the weight of it crashing over him. The most fragile moment of his life had been released to the world. By noon, the video had reached over 1 million views. National news outlets picked it up, weaving together commentary about kindness, poverty, and the quiet heroism of a man and his dog. Emails flooded into the police department's public inbox, messages, praising Daniel, messages begging for ways to help Emma, messages from strangers who confessed they too had once been invisible children. Daniel's captain called him into the office, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've gone viral, Hayes. The whole country is talking about you and that little girl." Daniel sat stiffly, unsure how to process the sudden attention. He hadn't helped Emma for cameras or headlines. He had helped her because she was hungry, because she mattered. Meanwhile, Grace's inbox overflowed. Some messages accused her of exploiting Emma's vulnerability, but far more poured out gratitude. One email read, "I was that girl once. Thank you for making me feel seen." Another, "My son has been in foster care for 2 years." This story reminded me that kindness still exists. Grace knew the backlash would come, but she also knew the message outweighed the noise. She responded to the most urgent emails, connecting donors with the local intake center, reaching out to advocacy groups, and making sure Emma would not be forgotten. The ripple effect widened by the hour. A local charity called Hearts and Hearths Foundation reached out directly to the police department. Meredith Langley, the regional coordinator, left a voicemail on Daniel's phone. Her voice was calm, confident, and urgent. "Sergeant Hayes, we saw the video. We would like to offer immediate legal and financial support if you are considering taking guardianship of the girl. We specialize in emergency foster transitions and officer-assisted placements. We believe what you did was more than kindness. It was destiny." Daniel replayed the message 3 times, his hand gripping the phone until his knuckles whitened. The thought of guardianship had not fully crystallized in his mind, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a jolt through his body. He looked at Ranger, who stared back at him with steady amber eyes, as if to say, "You already know the answer." Emma, meanwhile, had been placed at the local intake center overnight, wrapped in a donated blanket, and given a cot in a room that smelled of powdered soap and microwaved meals. But even there, she asked about Ranger. The intake worker Daria Cole later told Daniel. She mentioned him 6 times before falling asleep. She said she trusted him because he listened better than people. Daniel had nodded silently, swallowing the ache in his throat. He knew Emma's journey wasn't finished just because the world had seen her story. She needed more than a viral video. She needed permanence. She needed family. By the end of the week, the video had crossed 10 million views. Strangers mailed food, toys, and clothes to the intake center. Churches offered prayers, schools organized fundraisers, and people across the country wrote letters addressed simply to the little girl in the park. Emma had been invisible, but now she was seen by millions. Daniel sat in his squad car one evening with Ranger in the back seat, staring at his phone as donations ticked upward and messages poured in. He whispered aloud, as if confessing to the night, "This is bigger than me now." Ranger whined softly, pressing his nose against the window, and Daniel nodded. "I know, it's about her. It always was." He was not allowed inside the courtroom, but his presence outside the glass doors was more than symbolic. To Daniel Ranger's watchful eyes were his anchor, the reminder that this fight was not about publicity or viral stories, but about the little girl whose world had been torn apart. Emma sat with a court officer down the hall, her hair brushed back neatly, her small frame wrapped in a yellow hoodie donated by one of the staff, her eyes darting between the walls as if trying to memorize every escape route. She had grown more comfortable around Daniel, and Ranger even laughed once or twice when Ranger nudged her. But this place with its polished oak benches and echoes of authority pressed hard against her fragile sense of safety. Daniel clenched his jaw, reminding himself that this was necessary, that the court had to hear her story and his before deciding if Emma would be entrusted to his care. Judge Harrison, white-haired and broad-shouldered, despite a limp from years past, presided over the courtroom with a steady gaze. His voice carried weight, not just from the gavel, but from the years he had lived. He peered down at Daniel over his reading glasses, his lips twitching with the faintest trace of recognition. Daniel swallowed hard. This was the man who had once pulled him from behind a laundromat, bought him food, and gave him the first moment of dignity he had ever known. Now, decades later, Daniel stood before him, not as a boy in need, but as a man asking for the chance to do for Emma what had once been done for him. The symmetry of fate pressed against his chest with almost unbearable force. The first witnesses called were Margaret and Thomas Whitfield. They walked slowly to the stand, Margaret clutching her purse tightly, Thomas leaning heavily on his cane. Their voices trembled but held firm as they spoke about Daniel. Margaret told the judge how Daniel had been a constant presence after their son's death, visiting regularly, helping them with chores, and becoming in many ways the son they had lost. Thomas added, "If anyone deserves to raise a child with heart, it's this man. He knows what it means to lose, and he knows what it means to keep going." Their testimony rippled across the courtroom, drawing quiet nods from those seated in the back. Next came Daria Cole, the intake worker, who had welcomed Emma the first night she was brought in. She stood tall, but her eyes glistened as she recalled her own past. She revealed to the judge that years earlier she had been homeless, found by Daniel and Ranger during a snowstorm, half frozen behind the lumberyard. "He saved me without asking questions," she said. And when he brought Emma in that night, he sat outside with his dog, as if he couldn't bear to leave her alone. He came every day after work, just sitting there waiting like a father who wasn't allowed inside. That little girl smiles when she hears Ranger bark. That's not protocol, that's love. Her words brought a murmur through the room, and even Judge Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line as though restraining emotion. Meredith Langley from the Hearts and Hearths Foundation spoke next. Dressed sharply, her silver-streaked hair tied neatly, she carried the weight of authority with practiced ease. She presented the foundation's assessment, noting Daniel's record of service, his psychological evaluations, and the countless testimonies from colleagues and community members. "We believe Sergeant Hayes is not only capable of providing Emma with stability, but is uniquely positioned to give her the empathy and care she requires after trauma. This is not just about a temporary home. This is about rewriting the trajectory of her life." She laid the portfolio of documents before the judge, her eyes steady. "We stand ready to support him and Emma with every resource necessary." Finally, Daniel was called to speak. He stood tall, his uniform gleaming, his voice calm, though every nerve inside him felt exposed. He told the story of that afternoon in the park, how Emma had whispered her request to eat with him, how Ranger had wagged his tail and welcomed her, how she had confessed her broken childhood with courage beyond her years. He told the court about his own past, about Officer Whitaker saving him, and how he had become a cop because someone once saw him when he thought he was invisible. He spoke not as a policeman enforcing the law, but as a man offering his heart. "I didn't go to the park that day looking to change anyone's life," he said, his voice thick. But she asked me for lunch, and I knew immediately that I couldn't turn away. She deserves what was once given to me, a chance to be seen, to be loved, to grow without fear. I can give her that, and I will. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison closed the file before him. His eyes lingered on Daniel for a long moment, the lines of age etched deeper by the weight of memory. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, yet soft. "Sergeant Hayes, I raised you in a sense, though, not by law, but by the bond of choice. I know the man you have become because I helped shape him, and now you ask to do the same for this child." He paused, then lifted his gavel. "I do not need more paperwork to know who you are. You are hereby granted temporary guardianship of Emma, effective immediately, with full support from the department and Hearts and Hearths. A formal custody hearing will follow in 30 days. The gavel struck and gasps rippled through the small crowd, followed by soft applause. Outside the courtroom doors, Emma had been led down the hall by a young officer. Her yellow hoodie framed her thin shoulders, her hair brushed back neatly, but her eyes searched the crowd anxiously until she spotted Ranger. The dog leapt to his feet, tail whipping like a banner, barking once with joy. Emma broke into a run, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur as if finally home. Daniel stepped through the doors at that moment, unhooked Ranger's leash, and knelt to meet her halfway. She collided into his arms, whispering through tears, "I missed you." He hugged her tightly, his voice breaking. "I missed you too. You're coming home now." Judge Harrison watched from the doorway, a quiet smile softening his face as he saw the circle complete the boy he once saved, now saving another, the chain of compassion unbroken. Ranger barked once the sound, joyous and sharp, drawing smiles from strangers passing on the courthouse steps. Daniel opened the cruiser's back door, but Emma hesitated, her eyes darting between the courthouse and the street, as if unsure whether this victory was real. Daniel knelt to her level, his voice steady. "Emma, you're safe now. You're coming home with us." She blinked at the word home as though it was foreign and whispered, "For real." Daniel nodded firmly. "For real." She climbed into the back seat, a Ranger hopping in beside her, curling his large body protectively against hers, as though sealing the promise. The drive back through Maple Hollow was quiet, except for Ranger's soft breaths and the occasional squeak of the leather seats. Emma pressed her forehead to the window, watching the streets blur past. The houses looked solid, unshakable, with curtains fluttering in the windows and mailboxes lined neatly at the edge of lawns. She had spent so long drifting between alley shelters and abandoned corners of the town that the sight of permanence seemed like a dream. Daniel glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his chest tightening when he saw the wonder flickering across her face. He thought of himself at her age, staring out of car windows, waiting for the moment he would be left behind again. He tightened his grip on the wheel, vowing silently that she would never have to feel that again. When they pulled up to his modest house, Emma froze, her small body tensing, as if the ground itself might give way. The house was not grand, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with chipped counters, a living room with mismatched furniture, but it was warm. The curtains were drawn back to let in the afternoon light, and a flower pot rested on the porch, its blooms tilting toward the sun. Ranger leapt out first, bounding up the steps and sitting proudly by the door, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on Emma. Daniel opened her door, extending a hand. She looked at it for a long moment before slipping her fingers into his, her voice trembling. "This is really your house," Daniel smiled. "It's our house now." Inside, the scent of maple syrup and coffee lingered from breakfast. The walls carried framed photographs. Daniel in uniform, Ranger as a pup, landscapes from quiet trips. Emma's eyes darted from corner to corner, her breaths short and rapid. She clutched the hem of her hoodie, afraid to touch anything. Daniel noticed and crouched down, his voice gentle. "Emma, you don't have to be careful here, like you're not allowed. This is your home. You can sit anywhere, touch anything, fill the walls with your drawings if you want." She blinked at him, overwhelmed, then whispered, I've never had walls before. Daniel's throat tightened, and he reached for the small bag he had picked up earlier from the Foundation's office. He placed it on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of clean clothes, a pair of sneakers, and a small notebook with colored pencils. Emma gasped softly, her hands hovering over the notebook. "For me?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "For you. You can write your thoughts, draw whatever you want. No one's going to take it from you." She touched the cover with trembling fingers before hugging it to her chest. Ranger wagged his tail and nudged her leg, earning a shaky laugh from her lips. That evening, Daniel cooked pancakes, flipping them in the same old skillet that had seen countless lonely breakfasts. This time, the kitchen was alive. Emma sat at the table, her legs swinging beneath her chair, her dark curls tucked back with a pink headband. She concentrated hard as she poured syrup onto her plate, her tongue pressed against her lip. "Mama used to make pancakes," she murmured suddenly, her voice catching. Daniel set the spatula down, listening. She'd pressed them flat so they were crunchy. She said food tastes better when you smile. Her eyes filled, and for a moment, Daniel feared the grief would swallow her again, but instead, she smiled faintly. "These are almost as good." Daniel's heart clenched, but he chuckled softly. "Almost." She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Maybe if you make them again, they'll be just as good." Ranger rested beneath the table, his head on her foot, his steady presence grounding her with every breath. Later, after dishes were done, Daniel taped a new photo to the refrigerator. It showed Emma between him and Ranger on the courthouse steps, her arms wrapped tightly around the dog's neck, her crooked smile brighter than the sun overhead. Next to it, he taped a piece of paper Emma had written earlier, her handwriting uneven but determined. "Thank you for seeing me." She had insisted it be displayed so no one would forget. Daniel stared at the wall, his chest heavy with gratitude. For years, his house had been a shelter of solitude. Tonight, it felt like a living, breathing home. As the night deepened, Daniel tucked Emma into the spare bedroom, freshly made with new sheets and a soft blanket donated by the Foundation. She lay curled on her side, clutching Ranger's paw, where he sprawled beside the bed, his head resting near hers. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching as her eyelids grew heavy. She whispered, "You promise I can stay?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I promise. This is your home now." Her lips curved into a faint smile before sleep claimed her. Daniel walked to the living room, sat heavily on the couch, and ran his hands over his face. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but beneath it was something stronger, the warmth of purpose. He glanced at the courthouse photo again and thought of Judge Harrison's words of Officer Whitaker, who had once seen him of the circle that had brought him to this moment. He realized he wasn't just saving Emma. She was saving him too, pulling him out of the shadows of loneliness and reminding him that compassion was not a duty, but a gift. Ranger padded into the room, then curling up beside him with a satisfied sigh. Daniel reached down, scratching behind his ears. "We did good today, partner," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, steady and sure. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, golden and soft. Emma wandered into the kitchen in her new clothes, clutching the notebook to her chest. She set it on the table, opened it to a fresh page, and began to write with focused determination. Daniel poured her a glass of milk and asked, "What are you writing?" She glanced up, smiling shyly. "A list of things we can do now that I have a home." Daniel laughed, his heart swelling. "That's the best kind of list." He sat beside her, pointing to the wall near the pantry. "We could put up a chalkboard there, write our plans, draw pictures, whatever we want." Emma's eyes lit up. "Like Tuesday is pancake day." He nodded. "Exactly. And Ranger's birthday, even if we don't know when it is." Ranger wagged his tail at the mention of his name, earning another laugh from Emma. The morning sun rose steady over Maple Hollow, casting a warm glow through the checkered curtains of Daniel's kitchen, the same kitchen that once echoed with silence, but now brimmed with the sounds of life. Emma sat at the table with her notebook open. Her head bent low in concentration as she carefully wrote words in her uneven but determined handwriting. Ranger sprawled beneath her chair, his ears twitching, his tail sweeping the floor whenever her small hand reached down to brush his fur. Daniel leaned against the counter, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, watching them both with a quiet awe that swelled inside his chest. Only days ago, Emma had been a shadow in the park, barefoot, hollow-eyed, clutching at scraps of courage. Now she was filling blank pages with lists of dreams, as if she had always belonged. The house no longer felt like a shelter for one man and his dog. It felt like the beginning of a family. Emma looked up from her notebook and smiled, shy, but growing braver each day. "I wrote something for you," she said, sliding the page across the table. Daniel set his mug down and took it, his eyes scanning the crooked lines of pencil where she had written, "Dear people, thank you for seeing me. I thought the world forgot me, but now I have a home. I have a dog who listens, and I have a person who stayed." Daniel's throat tightened as he read, and he blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. "Emma," he whispered, his voice catching, "this is beautiful." She shrugged, her cheeks flushing. "It's true. You saw me when no one else did." Ranger pressed his nose against her hand, as if agreeing, and she giggled softly, the sound bright and unguarded. That day, Daniel drove her to the lake, where his foster father, Officer Whitaker, lived in a small cabin surrounded by pine trees. The road wound through hills, sunlight flashing between branches, and Emma pressed her face to the window in wonder. She wore the pink dress donated by the foundation, clean and warm, and she clutched Ranger's leash with both hands as if he were her anchor. When they arrived, Whitaker stood on the porch, his hair now fully white, but his frame still solid, his glasses catching the light. His face broke into a slow, wide smile as Daniel stepped out with Emma and Ranger. "So this is the girl who changed everything," Whitaker said warmly. Emma hesitated, half hiding behind Daniel, but Whitaker crouched slightly, his voice gentle. "You must be Emma. I heard you like pancakes. Lucky for you, I make them even crunchier than he does." Emma's eyes widened, then softened into a grin. Ranger barked once in approval, and Daniel laughed, the sound shaking free years of weight. Inside the cabin, they shared a meal 3 generations bound not by blood, but by choice. Whitaker listened as Emma told him about the chalkboard she and Daniel planned to hang in the kitchen, about the list of days she wanted to celebrate, Pancake Day, Ranger's birthday, even Hug Day once a week just to make sure nobody forgot. Whitaker's eyes misted as he listened. Then he placed a gnarled hand over Daniel's. "You're doing what I hoped you would. You're passing it on." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding. "I learned from the best." Emma beamed at both of them, her heart absorbing the truth that families are not only born, sometimes they are made in moments of compassion that refuse to let go. Weeks passed, and Emma blossomed in ways neither man had imagined possible. She filled the chalkboard with drawings of hearts and flowers. She laughed at Ranger's clumsy attempts to catch thrown biscuits, and she ran through the yard barefoot, not because she had nothing else to wear, but because she liked the feel of the grass between her toes. Daniel signed the custody papers a month later, standing again in front of Judge Harrison, who looked at him with pride as he declared the guardianship permanent. Emma clutched Ranger's paw in the courtroom and whispered, "We did it." Ranger wagged his tail, and Daniel smiled down at her, knowing the circle had closed. In time, the letter Emma had written spread across the Foundation's website, touching hearts far beyond Maple Hollow. People wrote back with words of encouragement, donations for other children, and promises to look more closely at those they once ignored. Daniel read a few aloud to Emma at night, his voice warm as she listened wide-eyed. "You reminded me to notice my neighbor. I adopted a rescue dog after seeing your story. You gave me hope to try again." Emma would smile, hug Ranger tightly, and whisper, "We helped them too." Daniel realized that the miracle of that day in the park was not just that he had found Emma, but that Emma had ignited a ripple of compassion that reached across strangers' lives. One morning, as the sun poured gold into the kitchen, Emma stood on tiptoe to tape a new photo beside the old ones on the refrigerator. In it, she stood between Daniel and Ranger on the courthouse steps. Her smile wide, her arms stretched, as if to hold them both together forever. Beside it, she taped another drawing. This one of 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one dog with the word family scrawled above in large, uneven letters. Daniel stared at it, his eyes burning with tears, and whispered, "Yes, that's us." Emma wrapped her arms around his waist. Ranger pressed against them both, and for a long moment the kitchen seemed to hum with a warmth greater than the sum of its parts. That night, as Emma fell asleep clutching her notebook, Daniel sat by the window watching the stars blink into being. He thought of the boy he once was cold and hungry behind a laundromat, and how one man's choice to stop to listen to care had rewritten his life. He thought of Emma, the girl in the pink dress who had whispered a question that pierced through his heart. "Can I eat with you?" That question had been small, almost fragile, but it had carried the weight of survival. He realized now that the answer he had given, "Of course you can," had been more than permission to share a meal. It had been a promise, a vow, a doorway into a future neither of them could have imagined. Ranger stirred at his feet, lifting his head to rest against Daniel's knee, amber eyes glowing with quiet knowing. Daniel scratched behind his ears and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We gave her a home." But she gave us one too. Outside, the night stretched silent and vast, but inside the house, warmth breathed in every corner. It was no longer just Daniel's house, no longer just a shelter against the cold. It was Emma's home, Ranger's home, their home. And in that truth lay the final message that kindness is not just an act, but a legacy. One heart seeing another and choosing not to turn away. The end. Before we close this story, let me ask you something. Did this journey move you the way it moved me while telling it? If it did, I'd love for you to support by giving this video a like and subscribing, so more stories like this can reach people who need a little light in their day. Tell me in the comments what part of this story struck you the hardest. Was it Emma's first quiet question, the courtroom's decision, or the moment she finally called Daniel and Ranger her family? And while you're there, share where you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far stories of compassion can travel across the world.